Welcome back to OpenLine. We're talking about body cameras on police officers here in Metro. Huge issue that communities across the country are dealing with. We are focusing on it here. We have for a while, but certainly the shooting of 31-year-old Jaquise Clemens has accelerated the discussion of this. We're on Facebook streaming that live if you want to comment there or call in. There's the number 615-737-PLUS. And you've had community meetings. What have we learned from other communities? Some communities have gone in to do this more quickly. Are there some worst case scenarios, some nightmare scenarios? What have we learned from what other cities have done?
Yeah, so Seattle is one community that comes to mind that did a rollout of all their officers at once. It wasn't an incremental deployment. And they actually purchased cameras for 62% of their officers, but deployed all within a year at the same time. And they really had a tough time with making sure the footage was recorded properly, was captured properly, stored properly. They just had a nightmare of a situation when they deployed. Now, they were one of the first cities to deploy, so they didn't have a lot of other cities to look at and learn from. Memphis purchased cameras and did not really have the policy in place that they thought that they were comfortable with deploying their cameras, so their cameras are still sitting on the shelf after purchasing.
So they bought them, but they're not using them.
They're not using them. So we've been very thoughtful about making sure that we have policy in place first, but we want to mitigate risk by looking at an incremental deployment. We don't want to try to deploy too many cameras at once without properly training the officers, and that's why we put so much emphasis on the training piece, because that's how you mitigate risk, that's how you make sure that the equipment is used properly, and our policy is a living document. We know that we may come into instances where we need to go back and look at the retention policy or the storage policy of how long we keep recordings and video and data for certain categories, because we have stepped that out based on the type of recording that's on the camera and stored. And so that's a living document. We know that we may have to revisit that. The DA has some concerns about how long we keep some storage based on litigation and active cases that he's working, and so we're willing to work through all of those issues as we start to deploy.
So where does that stand now? What do you do with all of that video? Do you have a sense how long you keep it, where it's stored? Where are we with that right now? So
our retention policy calls for a minimum of 90 days, 3 months for all footage. If footage shows that it's basically a non-encounter, so if it's footage of an officer while they're filling out reports or on a break, we're not going to retain that footage past the 90-day period. But there are instances if an officer has to use lethal force, if an officer gets into an altercation, if an officer is interacting with someone at a traffic stop, those recordings may be kept for a longer period of time. Some up to 6 months, some up to 9 months, some up to 3 years in some cases. And so the policy, once we release that to the public, will really lie out those categories and how long different types of footage will be kept.
And it's also a question too of when the camera's on and when the camera's off. And so what I think was discussed is, doing it when there's an officer, engaged with the citizen, and also we're looking at possibility of equipment that would maybe automatically turn the camera on, because
Yes.
there might be times where an officer is immediately engaged in a situation where the camera wasn't on and they have to react, and obviously we don't want to put that officer in harm's way by having to worry about the camera. So there are different mechanisms out there. We saw during that process some where if you remove your gun from your holster, the video automatically clicks on. Some when you turn your flashing lights on or you open your car door, it'll turn your camera on. So there are systems out there that can sort of do that. But one of the things to think about, we think about video in terms of use of force or shootings, but from an open records perspective, we have to think about, when do we record that? Because unless it's part of a criminal investigation, our open records laws in Tennessee are fairly liberal, and so you have to look at how are you going to release that data? How are you going to redact that data to make sure that you're not putting out any identifiable information that would violate some sort of HIPAA standards or what have you. So those are some of the things that will probably be worked out, one in the policy, but also as the testing phase and the implementation phase goes on, we learn more about how this is going to be used and accessed.
I mean, that is fascinating. When you start drilling down into it, it does get really interesting. And so, yeah, everybody's for body cam, or 95% is for body cams. The question is, when does it turn on? And so, no, that's an interesting debate. And where do you think we are on that? I mean, I guess it hadn't been decided, but when you turn on the lights to your patrol car, I think dash cams, I think with the highway patrol, I think that's one time they certainly come on. Is it something the officer manually just turns on, which means he could turn it on or off, whenever he wants, or is it something that happens automatically?
So we looked at equipment where it could happen automatically, and that's something we are considering. But we're also looking at equipment, so most cameras have a buffer process, and so the camera's always recording with some type of buffer, whether that's 30 seconds before they actually push the activation button, or it could be set to 3 to 10 minutes before the activation button is actually pushed. And so if it's continuously buffering and is activated, then it's going to capture that buffer footage also in that recorder. And so so we have a lot of different options to make sure that we're capturing the type of footage that we want to in an officer's shift or day. But like Sean said, we also want to be very respectful of privacy concerns for domestic violence victims, or for young people, or there was a lot of concern about immigrants and refugees in that community, and so we want to be very sensitive to certain populations' privacy.
That's certainly an issue. Lucy is on line 1. Let's go to Lucy. Hello, Lucy.
Hello, y'all.
Go right ahead.
Hey, I've got a question. You said a word that triggers me, and it's the word HIPAA. And in the past, I've seen cases where it's come out that the government kind of hides under HIPAA when they're caught between a rock and a hard place. For instance, like an officer-related shooting. For instance, like here in the past 4 years, we've had like 3 shootings that kind of perked my interest, and 3 of them were senior citizens, and 2 of them, I believe, and 1 of them I know for sure, the guy had a history of mental health. And although he had a gun in his hand, we have no proof that he actually did, point it at the officer. It is the officer's word. And I'm not trying to, ring the officer out here online. But, he might have had just a gun in it, and the officer was under stress. So, when it comes to HIPAA, if somebody has mental health issues or health issues, and they find out maybe they were diabetic and going low in their sugar, are y'all going to keep that from being public information? I'll take your response off air. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Yeah, I don't know that that's necessarily would be covered under this. What we're talking about really is, say you're reviewing a house and there's prescription medication, and how do you redact that information if that video is going to then be released, that type of thing. And also there is state legislation pending right now that would address some of these body camera issues about when the camera can be on. So there's a piece of legislation that would prevent you from having it on when you're in a school or when you're in a hospital, and so those are some of the issues that get identified through that process.
I'll add to that. A situation that came up in the CAG meetings was if an officer is at an accident situation and the EMTs are there actually providing a service for someone that was injured, and that just happened to be captured on camera, that is one situation that definitely may be protected under HIPAA law. And so that's another situation where you definitely want that type of footage where the officer's just present. They're not necessarily the ones engaging, but they just happen to capture the footage.
And just to go back a little bit, this is not really an effort to try to stop the video from being released. It's just making sure that we're compliant with the law. I think you saw with the shooting of Jacques Clemens that the police was very quick to release the videos that they captured through the MDHA cameras. So it's not so much trying to cover it up. It's a matter of making sure that you're protecting patients' rights.
Yes.
The chief, I think when he went with his $50 million proposal, you were saying it to be less than that, he had in there, I think, 9 employees to oversee the storage and to manage this big system of videos.
Yeah.
How are you thinking we're going to do that? Are we going to hire additional employees? Do you think we'll bid it out and have it run outside of Metro? What do you think?
So I do think we're going to need some additional employees to review footage. I mean, you're talking 1,400 officers, 6-hour shifts, and you're talking at least 5 shifts a week for each officer, and that's a lot of footage to go through the video, to audit that video, and so we are going to need additional resources and people put in the department to review that footage. The DA is going to need some additional people to review footage for his office for cases, and so will the public defender. And so we will have to provide the correct amount of resources to meet the needs that they're going to have with this type of equipment being deployed.
But to your question about data storage, I mean, that's really a question that gets answered through the procurement process and what we determine there. But there are some places that offer sort of a one-stop shop to get all of this stuff. What the chief proposed was a system that would be entirely housed within the MMPD, and so that might be good for some levels, but it may not be cost-effective in the end run, and that's going to be determined through that procurement process.
Sure.
So if you want to comment, we're streaming this live on our News Channel 5 Facebook page. If you comment, I will read your comment once I put on my glasses and once I get this working right. But go ahead and comment, and I promise I'll read your comment. Or give us a call. There's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.